Ok, we're good to start. Hola, mi nombre es Asher Rospigliosi, soy profesor de negocios en Escuela de Negocios en Brighton. Lo siento, no hablo catalán and hablo español mal, so I'm going to give this presentation in English. We are a small audience and maybe only some of us are here for the particularity of the subject, so please halt me, ask questions, ask for clarification. For administrative reasons, this session is going to be 2 hours long, but it's not necessary for me to talk all the time for 2 hours, so I would like to answer questions and make it as useful as I can. I like conversation. I think this is a good way of sharing, learning and understanding. And I want to look in this presentation at social media as a conversation, but I must confess that my research is in very early stages. So the majority of this presentation is the academic background, and it's not very academic. I teach digital marketing to students of business who want to know what it is, how we use it, what is it useful for. It's a functional view. So my context is largely explanatory of a development of technologies that support some business purposes, particularly around marketing. So I want to look a little bit at the growth of Web 2.0 and differentiates it from what went before, and the use of social networking online as a way of creating marketing, growing market awareness and developing things like brand loyalty. Then I want to think of some of the characteristics of conversation as a way of viewing marketing communication compared with an interruption model of marketing communication. I want to look a little bit at some characteristics of video games marketing, basically trying to build a case that video games, because of their internet-based or computer-based nature, have been an area where we might see early indicators of how marketing for electronic goods and services might develop. Then right at the end, and here I'm a bit apologetic because the detail of my research is very small, I have a little bit of a background on my own experience and why I maybe have some working insight into the connection between marketing and video games, my experience working at GameSpot UK. I'll look a little at the case study of the company I'm considering, Red Bedlam, and the author of the book, and the context in which the research takes place, a business school placement, and at the end outline what research I'm doing, but it's very early days. So, 2 of our audience have left the room already. My feelings will not be hurt if anyone thinks after a little while, actually, this is very familiar territory, I am very familiar with this and I don't need to stay. I could end up just talking to the camera and I'll survive because it's lovely to be in Barcelona. But let's think a little bit about the characteristics of social media and how it distinguishes itself from the kind of ways that we use the internet when the World Wide Web was first invented. So from sort of 93 to about 2000, we might characterize that as Web 1, static content. From the point of view of fans and consumers of content, there are opportunities to make home pages. So many people during the 90s who were not professional creators of content engaged with subjects of interest by creating a homepage about it. And this created a rich sort of ecosphere of shared communication. So fan websites about music or styles of life or video games existed, but to build them, users had to use technical tools like HTML and FTP to get the pages online. And when the results went online, they were not very compelling, limited to static pages. Web 2.0, the phrase was only really coined about 2004, but had been in development before anyone named it. It was at an O'Reilly conference that the idea of the web as a platform rather than as a publishing medium was first sort of explicitly talked about, and the idea of the web being a social experience, something that people participated in and that had the sort of the makings of a conversational platform. So in thinking about the social web, I want to think about some specific characteristics, one being the general concept of user-generated content, so the difference between professional publishers and media owners, and those who are publishing because they're paid to do it, and the kind of stuff that we see on the internet and that creates much of what people read and engage with. I'll look at a little bit of blogs because they're a very germane, specific example of the ways that people have replaced the homepage as a way of sort of media creation, and then look a little bit at online social networks. So one way of thinking about user-generated content is to divide it into different categories, and I quite like a taxonomy created by Cook in the Harvard Business Review in an article that I see as quite seminal in understanding the difference between active user-generated content, things like blogs, sharing pictures on picture sharing sites like Flickr, which Cook characterizes as active content aggregation. So places where people go and add their content. You log on to Flickr and you upload some pictures. You go to Wikipedia and you edit. What to me is interesting about this model of Cook's is that it distinguishes between the things that people are choosing to do and the things that happen just as a byproduct of users' behavior, which is not always, or maybe widely enough recognized as an important part of user-generated content. But in terms of marketing or other forms of communication, actually understanding things like web linking behavior, buyer behavior as people move through one site is a very profound is pretentious. It's a big insight into what people are doing with the content that content providers create. So, so Cook suggests that at the passive end, the end where people are not consciously trying to create user-generated content, we might think of their behavior as a contribution of content, and indeed their resources. So, for example, things like Skype draw on computing capacity distributed around the internet, made available by people having Skype running on their PC, but not necessarily anything where a person is thinking, I'm contributing to the communication network. So I've got here a sort of a list of some of the primary ways that we might think about users consciously or actively creating content beyond blogging. There's photo and video sharing. Link sharing turns out to be a very significant driver of traffic in some sectors. So although the social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter and Google Plus have a very visible profile, which would indicate that their use would be very important from the point of view of the media owners. Actually, in terms of traffic, websites like Dig, link sharing sites, have a much more a more massive impact on how people travel around the internet and find content. Then there are things like user reviews, where people choose to endorse or criticize a product. Wikipedia, I think of as a genre as itself, because it's become such a massive influence on how we understand as a body of consumers what things are in the world, and then social networking sites. And with social networking sites, one might think of the user-generated content going beyond active uploads of statuses and photos through to tagging as well. So the way that people label things on Facebook is a very significant contribution to our sort of understanding of what people are thinking about. So blogging, looking at that for a little bit, truncation of the term weblog. It predated the 2004 label Web 2.0. It's been around since the late 90s, and before that, as I mentioned, there were things like home pages, and even before that, Usenet and bulletin boards, which I'll look at again briefly later on. In terms of early examples that are relevant to gaming, Quake, the developers of the very influential first-person shooter game Quake, kept .plan updates, which were like a pre-RSS feed. So John Carnack, the creator of that game, would release an update as a .plan file daily on whatever he was working on, and people subscribed to that and followed that. I see that as being quite an interesting anticipation of the role of subscribing to a blog. And I say current numbers, I think this slide's about 6 months old, but you know, there are a lot of people blogging, hundreds of millions of people with live blogs. In terms of the impact on marketing, blogging might be seen to be significant for a number of reasons. We have the idea of people who are of influence to consumers who are trying to make choice. So influencers or opinion formers who have followers who read their blogs to help them make choices about products or lifestyle or consumption. We have the idea of long-tail niche. So that was an influential book by Anderson that suggested that conventional marketing communications and product distribution had focused on the best-selling items, and that the value of the many more niche interests actually accounts for a significant portion of the market. I assume everyone in this room knows Longtail. I could draw it on the whiteboard and talk it through if that were of use. Do you know Longtail? Are you familiar with that concept? Yeah. No? Okay, maybe I will. I don't know if the camera will catch it. So the idea of Longtail is if we have sales broken into units of quantity. If we were looking at something like feature films, we would say that 12 Years a Slave, actually that's probably not a very, very, very big seller. What were the other ones that, what were the other films that won Oscars this year? So popular films, yeah, Wolf of Wall Street. These are the films that many people in the audience will go and see, so they're worth putting on in cinemas and booking an exclusive venue for. But if we look at films that are of niche interest, like Metro Manila, which was the contribution from the Philippines to the Oscars this year, the national submission from the Oscars, for the Oscars from the Philippines, or indeed independent films made by artistic and independent filmmakers, that the value of each of those small selling items might end up contributing more to the economy and being of more value than the one or two blockbusters. So this was Anderson's idea. Anderson suggested that the long tail is worth as much as or more than all the other searches or items looked for in any particular marketplace. Quantitative analysis doesn't fully bear it out. Actually, more people do spend money going to see Wolf of Wall Street than is the added value of all the independent films uploaded to YouTube in any one year. But it is an interesting concept, because when we try to think about who is looking for our product and service and what is the appeal of it, while we might have some primary messages that are for the mass audience, actually many people will be searching for other attributes of our product. So if we were looking at this product, which is a Font Vela bottle of water, we might say most people are going to search for agua, but some people will be searching for agua 50 centilitres because they want a small quantity, and some may want it to come from a particular region I can't see where this comes from. Maybe it comes from some Sakhalm, I'm not sure. So some people may search for agua from Sakhalm. This is the long tail. And blogs are very influential in that, because if we create marketing communication about one product, a company or an organization will describe it in the language that they use with the attributes that they see as significant. But the blogosphere will fill the other descriptions, the one that says, I always choose Font Bella water because I love the color of the lid. The blue is just the right color to coordinate with my bow tie. So, in terms of the impact on marketing, we've got influencers, we've got niche interests, long tail searches, and the impact on Google natural search. So for many people, the way that we find products and services is by typing in a very specific request. I need a particular meal in a particular restaurant in a particular area, and it's bloggers that fill out that search feature. A couple of years ago, I had the e-commerce manager of Body Shop UK, who are a provider. I don't know if, are you familiar with Body Shop? Yeah, international, but okay. So the e-commerce manager of Body Shop came and said that of the purchases made on their website, 1/3 of the people who arrived and bought products came from beauty bloggers. So that it was primarily women writing blogs about the products, and that accounted for 1/3 of their inbound traffic, compared with any kind of interruptive or paid-for marketing. He was surprised, and I was surprised at the value of that. So related to the idea of the blog as a tool for marketing referral is the concept of affiliate marketing, that some companies pay to have bloggers build links in. So Amazon run a very successful affiliate campaign where for any particular product, for example, a sort of specialized Asian martial arts movie, Amazon can only describe it in limited terms, but a blog that is all about kung fu movies will extend the reach and allow sort of a long tail specialization of that communication, sometimes known as referral marketing. And blogging as an influential way of consumers identifying what they want to buy or what companies they want to interact with extends across a huge range of lifestyles. I've just chosen a few examples that I could think of, things that interest me, like food and fashion. I'm not interested in fast cars, but some people are. Okay, a concept I want to talk about just for a minute or two in relation to what we learn about from looking at blogs is the concept of the wisdom of crowds. This was an influential book by an American author in the mid-2000s, Surowiecki. And Surowiecki, who was a New York columnist, said that one of the benefits of looking at blogs is, and other forms of user-generated content, is that where you have a group, while individuals may not give the right answer, looking across the many contributions by a group, the aggregate, the total, is likely to come up with a better answer than any individual would. So the example he drew on is a very, very antique example. This is a sort of well recognized demonstration of the wisdom of the crowd. So a British scientist observing farmers looking at a cow, and an ox, a large male cow, and the farmers were trying to guess, to estimate the weight of the ox, which was about 1,000 kilograms. Each farmer suggested a weight for the ox, wrote it on a piece of paper, the papers were gathered, and no one came very close to getting the right weight, but the average of all the 800 estimates was 1197, where the real weight was 1198. So he was demonstrating how close the consensus across an average. And we might see that in a modern era with something like the film evaluation site Rotten Tomatoes. If we look at films there, they get, some people hate a film, some people like a film, but when we take the average, something like Rotten Tomatoes is a good predictor of which films will be popular. In terms of the idea of the wisdom of the crowd being a good way of deciding which films are successful or which are not, which products are successful or not. There are plenty of caveats. So one needs a wide set of opinions. One needs diversity in the crowd to avoid the risk of groupthink, where all people say the same thing. There needs to be easily shared information, which blogs make very easily, and a market selection, so something like vote-in or rank-in or tag-in. And sometimes one might need to remove poor solutions, so outliers, eccentric views may distort the findings. So it's not a mathematically infallible way of generating an understanding of opinion, but in some circumstances we can look across opinions of a crowd and get something that is accurate. Another concept that maybe is of interest when one thinks about the growth of blogging as a way of influencing the market is the concept of the cult of the amateur. Again, this is a journalistic analysis made by Andrew Keen, an entrepreneur and journalist in the mid-2000s, who was looking at Wikipedia and thinking about who creates the content and what can we say about the accuracy of it and why people participate. And essentially he's saying that the internet has brought about a culture in which each person has a viewpoint that they may wish to express as a valid expertise from their own opinion. And Andrew Keen was being critical. He was saying, can we trust this? Is this a valid way of understanding the shape of the world if we rely on Wikipedia? But I think the two concepts together, the wisdom of the crowd and the cult of the amateur, are a useful way of sort of evaluating why is it that we use blogs to choose which products to buy. Okay, moving on from blogging, looking at some of the other forms of shared user-generated content, the quantity of video created and shared by YouTube is, there's no sort of theoretical perspective, just very, very significant amount of content being shared video-wise, and the impact of that on taste and choice. For example, Psy's Gangnam Style, the Korean record that went to #1 in many national charts, the likelihood of a Korean pop singer being more well-known than Michael Jackson or the Beatles, or at least viewed by more people than Michael Jackson and the Beatles, the number of views, more people have seen that video than have seen any other video. I find that quite incredible and interesting as a way of thinking about how the sharing of user-generated content changes the way that we might think about what is important. And the Harlem Shake record is an interesting example as well, because very few people actually bought the record, and yet its influence was such that that Billboard, the US music chart authority, decided to use the number of views of user-generated versions of the Harlem Shake. Is that something that's familiar? Do you guys know, do you know the Harlem Shake? Do you remember that? Yeah. You know? Who? Okay, so Harlem Shake was something where a small piece of music called Harlem Shake was used by fans, by the public, to make their own dance version. So individuals would record themselves with their camera phone dancing to the Harlem Shake and upload it. So unlike Gangnam Style, this Gangnam Style, more people saw that than anybody else. With the Harlem Shake, there were thousands, so if you'd known it, you might have known one that was made by some journalists at a newspaper you were interested in, or fellow students, so a group of PhD students at your university might have made their version, the same music. So each video might only have been watched by 1,000 or 2,000 or maybe 25 people, but in total all the different versions of the Harlem Shake accounted to enough views that the US Billboard chart said that's the #1 record this week, but no one bought it. This is just a screenshot of Dig, the link sharing site. There are other ones like Stumbled Upon, for example, where users offer up links to content they found interesting. For my students at the University of Brighton, many of them do not use this. So this is not something necessarily used by young content consumers. But in terms of the traffic impact, if a story is on the front page of Dig, the number of people that will view that website has a very significant impact on the viewing of the site. So later on when I talk about the gaming company I've been working with, for them, being mentioned in the gaming section of Dig is of far more importance than if some individual users like their page on Facebook or retweet a link to their page. Even if they're influential gaming journalists, the impact on the traffic would be more significant on a link sharing site. The next category of user-generated content I want to think about are user reviews. So this is where consumers add their viewpoint on product. And for a website like Amazon, where this screenshot is taken, this has a very big impact on how people who are searching via Google will choose where to buy a product. So brief diversion into how search engine optimization works. If I wanted to buy an iPhone 5, and I go to Google and I type in, it's not, actually iPhone 5 is not a good example, let's choose something a little bit less generic. Yeah, if I want to buy an Android phone, and I go to Google and I type in Android phone, good for taking video and blogging, or good for playing games on, or good for running an app that will let me trade stocks and shares. Most of the descriptions of an Android phone, such as this Sony Ericsson one, on each website that sells it will be generic. They use the same words, they will use the product description provided by the manufacturer. But the user review allows Amazon's page, on a page that mentions a particular product, to have very specific claims and descriptions of the value of the product, personalized descriptions. I like, if a user reviews it, they will say something like, I like this phone because I like that it has a small keyboard that pops out. It's easy for me to use and to type on. This helps with long-tail search. So when people go and type in not just the name of a product, but some attributes of it, like is it good for typing on, Amazon's reviews are more likely to show up than a generic description. If that makes sense. There's also, of course, the impact of user reviews that are off-site, so on third-party reviewers' sites. So, for example, Mumsnet is a very influential website in the UK for parents who are interested in raising children. And if Mumsnet review the 5 best pushchairs and endorse a product as Mumsnet Best, then the McLaren Turbo XT will receive a lot of traffic, and its ranking on Google will be higher. If we type into Google, the best pushchair, this page may come up, but also the McLaren Turbo XT page may come up because of the reference, the way that Google uses reference to rank the value of different pages. I thought it might be interesting to think for a moment about why people create user-generated content, and one model that is helpful for analysing the use of user-generated content is the uses and gratifications model. So this may be a model that some in this room are more familiar with than me. I've not read about it in depth. Is this a model you recognise? Yeah, so I think the user, you're very welcome to correct me or add if you think it's useful, but my understanding of the model is that we are able to look at why people participate in content and the consumption or the production of it. And when we look at blogging, we might see that probably only 1 in 100 people who use blogs create them. But for those, there are opportunities for self-expression and self-actualization, so it's a validation of their viewpoint. For the consumer, we may read blogs for information if we're trying to choose which film to see or which pushchair to buy, and also for entertainment in the sort of more general use of media content. But that there's a reciprocal relationship that by responding to content as consumers, we help out the producers feel self-actualized, that they feel value by expressing their opinion, and that opinion being valued by those who read and use the blogs. Would you like to add anything? Okay. Thank you. One of the things that's difficult to evaluate when we look at something like blogs is the value of the content that is being shared. Let me just think about how to contextualize that. Well, often we use metrics. We count how many people have viewed something or read something or followed something. I used it here, so I said about YouTube, this. More people have watched this video than any other video. Does that matter? Did that influence anyone? Does that have an impact on people's choice? Are we more interested in Korean culture, having seen Gangnam Style? I think it's worth questioning that, because there are some quite anomalous viewing figures. So this Dutchman, PewDiePie, he has a channel on YouTube where he uploads videos that he takes computer games and he puts funny and horrific voiceovers, comic voiceovers on computer games. He has more people subscribed to his channel than Justin Bieber. So when he uploads a new video, last time I looked, over 16 million people will be notified that PewDiePie, he's a young man living in Brighton. He dropped out of university to run this channel. He manages to make a living through some product endorsements, but when we look at the impact and we say I don't like Justin Bieber, but if we look at Justin Bieber's profile in the world and the impact of the content he creates, and we look at PewDiePie, it's difficult to understand that PewDiePie has more people viewing him, but in terms of his market value, I don't believe he's as valuable as Justin Bieber. I want to think a little bit about where the value is created. So influencers are often cited as an important reason for understanding how people are using user-generated content. So if a blog is read by many people, is it an influencer? Well, Eliashberg and Shugan did some quite interesting studies of film reviews, and looking at this is pre-Web 2.0, it's looking at conventional journalism and trying to understand the relationship between those who influence or those who are predictors, and suggesting that it's not as easy as saying because a lot of people read a film review, that is why the film is popular. On the contrary, it's quite likely that a good film journalist, part of their skill is anticipating what it is the market will like rather than leading the market. And so there's been, I'm sorry I haven't got the reference here, but there was a study of tweets generated during the first day of a film's release in America over the last year, looking at how many people came out of the cinema and said, great movie, my friends should go and see it, or not. And there was a very strong correlation between films that had positive sentiment expressed on Twitter and films that were successful. But I'm saying, is that because it's an opinion leader, that all these people are persuading their followers to go and see the film, or is it that they're just predictors? I don't think it's easy to say yet. I think we're still in very early days of this. One way of understanding the role of influencers is by measuring how people look at their social media content. And there's a tool called Clout, which is widely used in digital marketing analysis. Are you familiar with Clout? Yeah, okay, so which is maybe a useful way of looking at content that someone creates, like a tweet, and seeing how it's shared across multiple social networks. And that may help us to understand whether they're an opinion leader or whether they're a predictor in the future. One other area of user-generated content I want to look at very briefly are mashups, which are where providers of content allow it to be reused in other sources. So combining data from somewhere or the presentation tool or the functionality and drawing them together. So some of the big content providers like Amazon, Google, some of the news sites will provide something like an RSS feed, or more sort of dynamically an open API. So with Google, if we want to make use of something like a Google map, it isn't just the data that is made available, but also the API, which is the application programming interface, a set of instructions that would allow another website to manipulate the data from somewhere like Google Maps. So Google Maps are probably the most widely used mashup software, but Amazon also in their affiliates program. If you were running a blog and you wanted to have the top 10 selling kung fu movies this week displayed on your blog, Amazon would allow you to draw that data from them. And I'm guessing in the context of journalism and analysis of newspaper, the sort of use of RSS feeds from individual newspapers would be a good way of understanding how a content provider is able to interact, or at least, yes, interact with those who want to make use of their data by embedding it in their blogs as an RSS feed, for example. Here's a screenshot of an example mashup, which takes a Google map and overlays location-based tweets so that we can zoom in on a particular location and in real time see what tweets are being generated in that location at any moment. Okay, so that's sort of part one of my lecture, Web 2.0. Now I want to look a little bit more at social networking and how that relates to marketing. So social networks, we should recognize, are not an internet phenomena. Social networks are a phenomena of human beings and culture. So they are the connection between entities, the social bonds or the social ties, according to Russell. Dowling et al. Suggested that we could view them as part of an organization or an individual's social capital. So the people who we know and who know us amount to a type of capital. The contacts and the ties that, and the norms and the trust that exists. And we can see that as something of value to individuals and to businesses, regardless of the format that the networking takes place in. Indeed, as I like this quote, Hansen said, yeah, beer drinking can be social networking if you have a group of people you go to the pub with. In terms of online social networking, we shouldn't view online social networking as a phenomenon that began with Facebook. So when ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, was first being trialed by the US Department of Research, they found that 3/4 of the traffic used on ARPANET in 1973, when the first round of testing was concluded, was email. So these were largely scientists and military researchers using the internet. The thing that they liked to do more than anything else was to talk to each other and build networks via email. From the mid-70s onward, the internet protocols provided something called Usenet, which was a shared discussion board around specialist topics. It was accessed via email protocols, so people could access it without having a continuous connection to the internet. Indeed, the early sort of bulletin boards were largely populated by content drawn from Usenet and shared. The content was categorized, was grouped into categories, so if one wanted to talk about recreational topics, they would be available in a particular hierarchy. And I like this screenshot because it shows my 7-year-old son, somewhere here, Nino, contributing to a discussion about European Italian footballers in 1995, so long before the sort of more generally accessible online social networks are available. This was a way in which specialist interests shared opinions, and it's all still archived in Google Groups, which is nice. You can go and find content as early as the sort of mid-1970s discussing which is the best film or which is the best restaurant to go to when you're visiting Barcelona. Before the massively influential online social networks, there was instant messengering. So for a period during the early 2000s, things like MSN Messenger were probably the most influential way for young people to share opinions and normalize and communicate and build networks. They tended to be, the acquisition of contacts was more difficult with these type of networks. They needed to be someone you already knew generally. It was more difficult to traverse other people's networks. I'll look at that in the characteristics of online social networking applications in a moment. But things like internet relay chat, or more recently Skype and MSN and Yahoo, provided one-to-one messaging. And we still see things like WhatsApp and Snapchat being used primarily as one-to-one messengering tools. But when we're thinking about social networking online, we probably really mean the online social networking services and the characteristics of them that make them quite different from the other things I talked about, email, Usenet, and instant messaging, are that one constructs a public or semi-public profile that others can discover, and that when you've discovered a profile, a friend who you know on Facebook or Twitter, you can look at the list of their connections. So it makes the extension of the network much easier and more manageable than in something like MSN Messenger, where finding somebody's MSN Messenger username required you to contact them somehow. And so being able to traverse the list of connections, Boyd and Ellison have probably done a fairly definitive way of distinguishing online social networks from other ways of doing social networking. I've got a couple of slides that just would want to remind us that the arrival of Twitter in 2006 or Facebook in 2005 wasn't the beginning of online social networking. So something like 6degrees.com in 1997 had those same characteristics. Explicitly, if you created an account on 6degrees.com, there was an implicit expectation that if you traversed one person's network to another, you could find Kevin Bacon, I think was how they sold it at the time. That we are never more than 6 steps away, 6 connections away from anyone else in the world. And this draws on fairly well academically explored ideas about how big networks are between individuals, going right the way back to Milgram's Small World experiment, where letters, paper-based letters, were passed from one user to another, and it only took 6 steps for a letter to reach anybody in the United States. Social networks are growing very fast. They're acquiring new users. So this just gives some stats from about a year ago on the growth of at the time some fairly newly arriving sites like Pinterest, gathering users very quickly. While there's a huge gulf between any of these and Facebook, it gives a sort of indication of direction of travel, large numbers. Anyone in this room use Pinterest? One, thank you. Yeah. Another commercially provided an infographic just giving us a sense of total numbers of users. So in this room, Pinterest is accurately represented as being a more minority usage. But there are sites like Orkut, where if we were going to Brazil, we might want to know about Orkut, because if you're going to go and see the World Cup there are 66 million users of Orkut, and almost all of them are in Brazil. Anyone in this room use Orkut? No. I think you have to speak Portuguese to be able to. Same infographic. I like the picture side. In terms of those who have got over 100 million users, some like Weibo and Renren, we may only be vaguely aware of. Anyone in this room used Weibo? I haven't. I wouldn't know how to. Badu, not known in the UK at all. Anyone in this room use Badu? Apparently widely used in some parts of Europe and Latin America. It's got more than 100 million users, none of us. In terms of when this screenshot was created, 2012, Foursquare, Instagram and Tumblr were all seen as fast rising. I think if we looked at more recent figures, we'd find that Foursquare hasn't kept up and that Instagram has probably outpaced it significantly. And then there are sites like Flickr and LinkedIn that haven't acquired massive numbers of new users through the years, but have got a significant impact in a particular sector. So Flickr for picture sharing or LinkedIn for professional referrals. Oh, I've got more out of these pictures than I need. What have we got here? I can't even remember why I took that picture. Sample growth increases from year 3 to year 4. Oh, so giving a sense of the speed of growth. So Flickr, for example, grew 3 times between year 3 and year 4, whereas Twitter grew 8 times. I think what we might take from this is that as new social networks are made available, the likelihood of them growing rapidly is increasing, but it's not a good slide, this. Sorry, it's a bit old. It'd be more useful to see how Instagram is doing. In terms of, this is very much for business school students, so the idea of how one would use social networks as a way of marketing. Forrester Research, who is a commercial research organisation, came up with sort of 4 steps that one would want to use in terms of thinking through how social networking might be used for marketing. And like most American business strategies, it's got a nice 4-letter acronym, so POST. The idea that one identifies the target audience, who it is that one would want to communicate with, would affect which choice of network we are likely to use. So the difference between using LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter would say something about whether we were trying to do professional to professional networking. Instagram more likely if we were trying to do something visual and youth-oriented, like fashion. Twitter may be more to do with things like journalistic communication. So which audience we're looking for. Sorry, that was anticipating the activity. Who it is we're looking for, what kind of communication we want to make with them, and then what the strategy for interacting them would be before choosing which of the technology platforms is most useful. One more or less a final slide on social networks and marketing is to look at some of the ways that we might view this from different academic perspectives. So, in terms of the impacts of social networks on marketing, probably the most important concept is the idea of word of mouth and the value of word of mouth. And tomorrow, for the PhD students, if anyone's watching this video twice, there'll be a difference in that I've got a lecture to talk about the impact of word of mouth. I'm not going to look at that today because I don't see that as core to understanding the conversational characteristics of the research I want to talk about later. But word of mouth undoubtedly is very important in terms of understanding why social networks might influence consumer choice. Barnes did some interesting work on what she described as the privacy paradox. And that's the idea that when people, consumers, are asked about their attitude to sharing private information about themselves, most users express a reticence to share large quantities of information about themselves. If you say, are you willing to tell people what choice of food and drink you make late at night, or who you hang out with in the evening, most people, when asked, this was young American students. When I say most people, sorry, the sample was American students in 2006. Most students said, no, I would not want to tell people intimate details of who I spent my evenings with in a public way. And yet those same sample, we're using Facebook to do exactly that. So there's a paradox between what people say they want to share about information about their life and what they actually share using online social networks. And then the last concept I want to think about a little bit is the idea of experiential marketing, which Palmer and Koenig-Lewis did some research on. And that's talking about the difference between where we build our sense of connection with those who create content. So content producers have traditionally had a direct relationship with customers. So content producers might, for example, have a website that customers visit, or they might have an email newsletter that they send customers, and it's an unmediated relationship between the producer and the customer. If we're looking back over marketing for the last 7,500, 150 years, whether it's print or internet, the relationship's being direct. And what Palmer and Koenig-Lewis wanted to look at was the role of community shared response. So this is things like discussion boards, forums, blogs, where there are communities of users who build their own content, and increasingly that is the area where customers are likely to find a valued opinion. So if we were trying to choose a beauty product, my experience with the e-commerce manager from Body Shop would be that a significant number of people would be less likely to go to the Body Shop website and read about the products there, but instead to engage with a community of other third parties, beauty bloggers, who are expressing an opinion about the product. I've got a couple of examples of successful uses of social media for marketing. Not a very good screenshot, I'm afraid. Sorry. There is a video clip available of this if you wanted to see how it worked. So IKEA, when they opened a new branch in Malmo, ran a photo tagging competition where showroom photographs were uploaded and users could tag themselves in the photograph against specific objects, and so by so doing win the object. So if there was a kitchen, you could go and tag yourself as the cooker. The cooker would then say Asher was tagged in the photograph of a cooker, and I would get the cooker for free. And this was very effective in that the social networks of those who tagged themselves tended to go and follow it up. So this screenshot is from late at night, 1 o'clock in the morning, with people saying, will you upload a picture now? We want to tag ourselves in a picture as well and get free goods. So it built a real high level of interest. Another example was a campaign run by Jimmy Choo's Shoes, who used Twitter to share pictures of bags containing a pair of shoes left in locations around New York, and customers could go and find the bag. There weren't a pair of shoes in it, but if they tagged themselves on Foursquare as being in the location where the bag was, then they did get entered into a competition to win a pair of shoes. And one third example is Innocent, who make fruit juices, smoothies and things like that. And they sent out tweets during the course of the day, and depending on where in the course of the day you got the tweet, you got a different discount. So if you retweeted their message, you'd get a discount ranging between getting a product for free or getting 50 pence off the drink or the pot. So it's a way of getting people to share on their social networks their engagement. Wouldn't quite call it a conversation. Okay, how are we doing? When I teach in UK, I generally like to try and get my audience to help me to understand what sense is being made of what I'm talking about. So I think before I start on conversation interruption, can I just encourage, are there any questions or anything that is useful to draw out further at the moment? No. Okay. Then let me look a little bit at the role of permission marketing, as Seth Godin called it, which is distinguishing between the way that companies might interrupt us or might engage us in a conversation. So Seth Godin, is this someone you guys are familiar with? Yeah, some, good. Seth Godin, right at the end of the 90s, came up with the idea of permission marketing, which is the sense that effective marketing communication is something where the consumer welcomes it and wants to see the content come into them. So if somebody subscribes to an email newsletter, was what he was particularly focused on, was email newsletters, but the same might be said of following a Twitter feed or subscribing to an RSS feed, that effective marketing will encourage the consumer to see this as a long-term relationship in which there is a reward for responding, because the message will become increasingly relevant. So the example that Seth Godin gave was his own website, where he gave away the first 5 chapters of his book, this best-selling book called Permission Marketing. You could get the first half of it for free by going to his website, and it was very specific. It was a product that would help people to do email marketing better. So he ran a website that said, if you want to learn the secrets of email marketing, give me your email address, download the book. But the clever nuance in his permission marketing is the idea that you adjust the incentives and fine-tune as you build more of an insight into what the consumer wants. So you send them a newsletter, but you ask them to respond if there's anything that's useful, or you measure which links they click through on. And by doing that, you're able to build up a more fine-tuned vision of what it is they're interested by. And then you increase the permissions. So if, for example, you send them a newsletter that has offers for discounts on wine and discounts on food, and they click on the discounts on wine, then you send them an email saying, would you like more news about wine discounts? Are you interested in wine? Do you prefer red or do you prefer white? And that allows the content creator, the marketer, to gather more data about the customer's personal life or interests or hobbies and introduce new products and categories of service, but without broadcasting it at them. It's built on a concept that they are asking you for information that they've expressed an interest in, and that would build a profitable situation for both, that the provider of information is able to send marketing information that's tailored to the interest of the consumer, and the consumer is getting email that interests them. So, yeah, sorry, repeating some of this. So how Seth Godin did it was get the email address in return for 1/3 of the book for free. And then he distinguished what he was doing with this permission marketing compared with interruption marketing. So he characterized the kind of marketing communications that were prevalent at the time, that is, building a website, or taking a page in a newspaper, or running a commercial on the television, or in the cinema, or on the radio, as interruption marketing. People have to stop what they're doing to consume it, and that as more channels proliferate, there's a trade because there's a limited amount of time that the audience is willing to spend, and there is more diversity, more different communications being pushed towards the audience all the time, and so there's an expensive escalation or attrition. That is, that if a creator of a product or service wants to catch someone's attention, they have to spend more if they're going to do it by interruption than in a period where there were less channels. So the proliferation of different channels to market makes it more difficult for interruption marketing to work, whereas permission marketing builds on the idea that people will look at the content because it interests them, because they want to see it. In terms of analysing the kind of websites and relationships that might build up out of that, Krishnamurti did a study in 2001 where he tried to categorise some of the different types of relationships between those who produce content and those who give them permission to consume it. So in the simplest model, as in the one Seth Godin was outlining, the consumer gives permission to a particular company. You sign up for Amazon's newsletter and you say, yes, I'm happy to have Amazon send me an email about products and services. That's our direct relationship maintenance, where a provider of content or news or products has a one-to-one relationship with the consumer. We might also see permission partnerships. Here Krishnamurti was looking about how organizations acquire the consent of the consumer to sign up for a newsletter. And Krishnamurti suggested that news aggregating sites often capture people's email addresses to build a permission marketing relationship with their partners. So if we're the New York Times, we both would ask people to sign up for the New York Times newsletter, but we would sell advertising space on that newsletter to providers of books or holidays or other products and services. And effectively those are partners where permission is extended by the consumer signing up for the New York Times newsletter or ZDNet newsletter to get information from the partners. And the same nuancing of the refining of this idea of the fine-tuning can occur because the New York Times can monitor which ads or content users respond to and which they don't. So Krishnamurti suggested that was a second model. He added two further models, which I only find that I can think of one example for, really. Be very happy if anyone else. I've never really found a very good example of a permission pool. But we do see ad markets, things like Groupon. Everybody know Groupon, yeah? So Groupon doesn't provide any content of its own. People only use Groupon to sign up for permission-based marketing for products and services that they hope will be fine-tuned to them. So where Groupon works well, a consumer will say, I'm interested in fashion, and Groupon will send them adverts for discounts to fashion. Krishnamurti also suggested there was something called a permission pool, which was several partners working together with advertisers. But the examples he gave, which were from 2000, 2001, don't seem to be relevant anymore to me. But I think Groupon is, well, yeah. So the model has some limitations, or my ability to apply it does anyway. Okay, now I'd like to look a little bit at the relationship of video games to online marketing. And work towards the sort of case study of the research that I'm just beginning. So with video games marketing, there's a couple of characteristics of the video games market that I'll point out. It's very large. So there are $90 million being generated in the US alone on games in 2013. And it's a global business, so successful video games are consumed throughout the world. Video games have some quite strange characteristics that they're bought very seasonally. So a lot of the video game sales happen at Christmas. And throughout the rest of the year, video game sales are significantly lower. They also peak when there's a new console released or some other hardware-driven market stimulant. When a new game comes out, typically it only sells in large quantities for a short time and then tails off. There's a very marked burst of sales, and then the sales time diminishes quickly. When new games are released, there's a lot of coverage of them in the specialist review sites. So in the lead up with the release of a new game, there'll be large sort of journalistic coverage. So when something like the latest version of Grand Theft Auto comes out, the mainstream press will cover it in the weeks leading up to its release and its release. But a week later, 2 weeks later, it will have disappeared from being written about. So for computer games, a bit like cinema, but cinema has multiple releases because the DVD means that it gets covered again. There's a huge importance in building market interest in the new game before it arrives, so that in those first few weeks when it's being covered, people who are going to buy it. And video games are early adopters of social media. So the use of online marketing for social media has been written about since the sort of early 2000s. People like Grimes or Bagulian have looked at studies of the use of people discussing games in things like forums and on blogs. And as I mentioned earlier, before blogging, games like Quake 2 were very widely discussed on fan sites, and the information would come directly from the creator of the game, so John Carnac, with his .plan updates. Also, the video games world has been an early adopter of user-generated content before the idea was widely known in the more general use of the internet. Games like Quake relied on fans creating additional skins and levels and sharing them through fan communities to enhance the value of the game. Likewise with the simulation, The Sims, much of the value in the game is in being able to download accessories and levels that have been created by the consumers. In terms of my research and my relationship between what I'm beginning to look at and my background, I'll just talk through some sort of key elements in what the research, the players in the research. And the first thing is that my background is in software development for, well, website building and content management systems for GameSpot UK. So my first sort of internet job during the mid-1990s to 2000 was building the GameSpot UK website, which was a successful award-winning consumer website. It had at the time fairly cutting-edge technology in that it was a content management system built in Perl and Tickle, and compared with, so the company I was working for at GameSpot was owned by ZDNet CNET, who are a global publisher of technology news. GameSpot during the late 90s had the highest traffic, and the traffic was built by a conversation between us and the fan sites. So when a new release of a game was anticipated, we would build interest by contacting fan sites, forums, and the content owners of the games, and building a relationship between specialist audiences who were following particular forums and the owners of the games by saying to the owners of the games, give us a bunch of screenshots, for example. So something like Tomb Raider 2, which was a very popular game in the late 1990s, we would get a set of exclusive screenshots, make them available on GameSpot UK, and then the fan sites would talk about these pictures of Lara Croft jumping around and how good they were, and we would see traffic of a million visitors based on the response of fans to what we were offering. In the research that I'm looking at now, I'm working with a company called Red Bedlam, who are based in Brighton. They're a small software development company. They've got 20 coders. They've only been in existence for about 10 years. And they've grown recently, so they've had 20 coders in the last year. They were a core of about 4 developers who built massive multiplayer online role-play games, particularly for children. So they were building products that were quite niche, and it was pan-European. They were actually working with a French company who provided the editorial content. Their owner, manager, Nick Witcher, is a fan of science fiction and liked a particular writer, Chris Brookmyre, who has written about a dozen best-selling science fiction books and who clearly has an interest in video games. So Brookmyre's books mention games and talk with a knowledge about games. So Witcher got in touch with him and just sent him an email saying, might you be interested in writing a novel that would feature a plot that would then be developed in a video game. And it kind of formed what I like to think of as quite a postmodern scenario, because the game tells the story of a book that features a game, and the book is about a game that is generating a book. So there's a sort of nice reciprocal relationship between the editorial content created by Brookmeyer and the game that's being built. Being built because it's not ready yet, but at the end of last year, Red Bedlam got in touch with my business school and said, we need to develop an interest in the game in advance. And the business school runs an industrial placement program, so students in their third year can spend 1 year working full-time. So we've got 2 students working full-time at Red Bedlam, one as the website manager for the Bedlam the game, and one as their social media manager. So his responsibility is for building interest on social media sites for the game as it develops. So the moment, the methodology that I've begun on, and this very much is very early days, so I don't have very much data yet, but I'm looking at quantitative data, so the social media usage, and particularly not just at followers, but trying to understand how people are talking about the game, so mentions and retweets. But we're also going to look at doing some kind of qualitative analysis of the data using sentiment analysis. I've also got interviews available, so I've done first round of interviews with the owner-manager and the 2 embedded students, the social media manager and the website manager. So far I've only got 7 weeks worth of data captured, so we're seeing quite a slow rate of acquisition of followers. So this is a Twitter account created for generating interest in the game, and last week there were 102, there's 103 currently. In terms of conversion rate, seeing people respond to content, I can't remember what amplification and applause measures. This is a metric drawn from an analysis tool, so a very early stage of work. So the idea is that I'm going to use social network analysis as a way of understanding what is happening with the tweets as they're shared and trying to get an understanding of what communities of users interact with them. So I've looked a little bit at social network analysis. I'm by no means an expert at it, but I'm able to say that it's a mathematical technique that allows us to analyse who is connected to who and something about the nature of the connections. And I'd be very interested, if we do a little bit of discussion afterwards, to have thoughts about how best to use this, because this is very early days. But some of the properties of a network that we might be able to get insight into using this mathematical technique is the density of the network. So how many people are connected to each other as they're talking about the game, what the nature of those connections is. Some of these terms I'm not very familiar with the meaning of, so centrality and connectedness, I would have difficulty in describing what their meaning is. But I'm aware of the importance of bridges and holes. So bridges are the characteristic of joining one network to another. So if, for example, some of the people who are responding to tweets about this game are gaming journalists, and others are fan consumers, and others are, for example, media correspondents, each of those different groups may not have many connections between them. The connection may be someone with a high profile. So if you've got a gaming journalist who's also followed by a lot of fans, what we get there is a bridge. And the interest of holes is that that may help us to identify parts of the network where the message is not being shared. So it's a concept written about by a guy called Burt, who sees that the nature of networks is that there are areas where a bridge may bring message from like one part of the network to another part of the network, but within this part, for example, there may be holes, area where the density is low, and any particular participant in that part of the network may not see communication that relates to the game that is at the centre of the network, let's say. There's also a concept of the nature of the ties, strong and weak ties, and this is something that I've found quite interesting, but I think it's difficult at present to say very clearly how it would be used for understanding what happens on Twitter or on online social networks. But the idea that some ties have the characteristic of being strong ties, which are ties to people in the network that we are closely connected to, people whose statuses we look at every day, if it were Facebook, or whose Twitter feed, tweets we make sure we don't miss, or in an offline network looking at people who we see with a high level of frequency, so family members, co-workers, fellow students, people in a physical network who are close to us. Those all have the characteristic of being strong ties if we see them frequently. Weak ties are members of a network that we're connected to, but that we only have infrequent contact with. So maybe a Twitter feed that we look at once a week. And writers or analysts of these strong and weak ties say that they're important to understand because often the weak ties are the ones where we get the bridges between networks. So where we have strong ties, much of the information that we have access to is shared, the same as other members of our strongly connected network. Weak ties may bring in novel information because there is less overlap of what it is we know, because they are less closely connected with the context in which we exist. So I think, as I understand this, weak ties might be a useful way of understanding how a message that is being shared, for example, amongst enthusiast gamers might reach influential journalists who might write about this game as being an exciting and novel game. And then I've mentioned gamers several times, but because of the involvement of Chris Brookmyre, the author, we also have networks that would be related to literature and writing, which, again, the idea of a weak tie might be that if, in an ideal scenario, if a journalist who writes about books saw the connection with Brookmyre to the game and wrote about the game, one might get an extension of the network, a bridge. That's my attempt to talk through social networking. For the last few slides, I've got some examples of the kind of data I'm capturing. So this is the frankly quite ugly Bedlam the Game Twitter feed with examples of, this was taken on April the 2nd, Chris Brookmyre, the author of the book, interacting, so making direct mentions of events and people, and that was retweeted by Bedlam the Game, the account. So an attempt to draw together two networks, Brookmyre's and the game community. This is a tool I'm using to retrieve lists of details about the followers of Bedlam the Game at the moment, and try to build a sort of a way of monitoring their activity. I've tried experimenting with NodeXL. Is that a familiar? Anyone know NodeXL? It's a piece of open source software that retrieves Twitter followers for an individual or tweets for a hashtag or a search. So I've used NodeXL, and it's got some export features that allow one to build graphic representation. So this is Bedlam the followers represented visually, but it's to my mind at the moment, it's of limited analytic use. I mean, it shows me a picture with icons representing the followers, but I don't see it as being strongly used for analysis. I use the same tool to look for a snapshot of mentions. So in one 6-hour period, or I think it's 6-hour, 12-hour period, these are mentions in which followers of the game either mention each other or mention the game. So that seems to me to indicate, when we've only got 103 followers, that there's quite a high degree of connectedness within the network, that there are a lot of people mentioning each other or the game in a brief period of time.
Which is the name of this tool?
This is called NodeXL. I think I've got on the, did I? Yeah, it's here, NodeXL. and it's a plugin or a template that you can use with Microsoft Excel, but it's a free open source extension, and it seems to me at the moment to be the most effective way of capturing extended Twitter networks, because I was using Perl. I've made some attempts to do this before, but Twitter's got quite a lot of restrictions on the way its API, its programming interface works, that limit the amount of data you can take at any one time, unless you're paying for it. So I mean, there are ways of getting unlimited access to the Twitter feed if you pay to use the fire hose. But this, if you're willing to wait and just take snapshots at periodic intervals, it retrieves the data and puts it into a spreadsheet in a way that's then quite useful. And it has these export features that allow one to build visual representation. But there doesn't seem to be very strong analytic capability in the tool. It's mostly a way of building a spreadsheet that looks like that, and then you need to do something with it. So I'm going to sit down now because I'm stopping lecturing and happy to talk, and also very hoping that you guys might have suggestions about what I could do next or approaches to the data set. So yeah, any questions or comments, or suggestions? Well, can I ask you a question, please? Are you you said you were capturing tweets from particular news organisations. What software are you using to do that? Or how are you doing that?
Okay, I'm doing that very simple form. I don't know how to say. I'm analyzing 2 hours and a half per day
Yeah.
for communication media.
Yes.
For companies, and I just copy.
Okay, from the web page.
From the Twitter.
Yes, from the Twitter page. Yes.
And then pass to a Word.
Yeah.
Very chapuza. I
Yeah.
don't know how to say in English.
Yes, I know.
But it's not very professional
Mm-hmm.
form, but I'm doing that. And then I annotate in an Excel
Yeah.
the tweet and the retweets and the favorites and comments.
Yes.
That the tweet has.
Okay, so thank you. So maybe of what I've talked about, maybe this Node XL might be useful in that context, in that you could,
Yes, I
you-
will try to
you-
use this.
you certainly could capture both the tweets from the news provider, but also retweets and mentions if you wanted to see how that content was consumed, whether the audience were responding to it. So, okay. Is anyone else capturing Twitter at the moment in any way?
But one question.
Please.
How works this Node XL?
Okay, so
How do you do it?
how do you use it? So it's from this website. You download, and it's a template. So it's an Excel spreadsheet that they've created that if you open and then save with a new name, it has some additional menus that say retrieve data from Twitter. You can also use it to retrieve from Facebook, your own network on Facebook and other places, Flickr. But for Twitter, you would put in the name of the Twitter news, the account, and there is a 2-stage authentication. So you press submit, and it takes you to your Twitter page, and you have to log in, and then it says, do you authorize, blah, blah, blah. It gives you a PIN number, a code that you put back into the spreadsheet to allow it to access Twitter via your account. And then you put in the name of a search or the name of a Twitter account you want to retrieve, and you say, bring me all the followers, or bring me all the tweets in the last 1 hour or 5 hours, so, or 2.5 hours.
And you can program, for example, capture the tweet for tomorrow to...
For timescale, I've not tried that. For monitoring a Twitter account over time, I use another tool. Have I got internet access here, I wonder? By a British journalist or media correspondent called Hawksey. I'll see if I can find it. So this spreadsheet is one that you can set for time. So you can, it's a Google spreadsheet, so it's a Google Doc that allows you to, so that's what I've used. This is Hawksey's spreadsheet in Google Docs, and there you can say, for a time period, retrieve all the tweets, and it stores them, you know, with links, the comments, everything. It's very a nice tool. So that's this guy, Martin Hawksey. If you want to send me an email, or we can, you know, make sure you've got it if you want. Okay. So any other questions? I'm going to turn off the microphone.